For years, Linux has lived with a reputation that followed it everywhere like a shadow it couldn't escape. People admired its power, its freedom, its security, and the passionate community behind it, yet at the same time they whispered about its biggest weakness. They said Linux was complicated. They said it wasn't ready for everyday users. They said gaming was limited, software support was confusing, hardware compatibility was unpredictable, and that it always felt like an operating system made by developers for developers. But something has changed, and in 2026 the conversation sounds very different. The question many people are asking now isn't whether Linux is powerful, but whether it has finally overcome the one weakness that held it back for decades. And to understand what's happening, you have to look at how Linux quietly evolved, while the rest of the tech world was distracted by flashy updates and corporate ecosystems. Back in the early days, Linux thrived mainly in servers and developer environments. It powered huge portions of the internet, ran data centers, and formed the backbone of Android. Yet on the desktop, it struggled to gain mainstream acceptance. One reason was fragmentation. New users would hear about Ubuntu, Fedora, Arch, Debian, Mint, and dozens of other distributions, and instead of feeling empowered, they felt overwhelmed. The idea that you had to choose a distro before you even began created friction that Windows and Mac OS users never experienced. Over time, though, Linux communities realized that simplicity mattered just as much as freedom. Modern distributions began focusing heavily on user experience, with polished installers, intuitive desktop environments, and automatic driver support that worked out of the box. What used to require terminal commands and hours of troubleshooting can now be done with a few clicks, and this shift has quietly removed one of the largest barriers for new users. Another major turning point came from gaming. For years, critics argued that Linux could never succeed on the desktop because games didn't support it. Developers prioritized Windows, anti-cheat systems blocked compatibility layers, and performance gaps discouraged players from switching. Then something unexpected happened. Proton and similar compatibility technologies matured to the point where thousands of Windows games ran on Linux with minimal effort. The rise of handheld gaming devices running Linux-based systems introduced millions of players to a different reality. Linux wasn't just viable, it was often smoother and more customizable. Game studios began paying attention, and anti-cheat developers slowly added support. In 2026, the idea that Linux can't handle gaming feels outdated, even though challenges still exist. The narrative has shifted from "can you game on Linux?" to "which games still need work?" Hardware support, once a major weakness, has also seen dramatic improvements. Manufacturers realize that Linux users represent a passionate and technically savvy audience. Graphics drivers from major GPU vendors improved significantly, with better performance parity compared to Windows. Laptop manufacturers began shipping devices with Linux pre-installed, something that would have sounded unrealistic a decade ago. Firmware updates, power management, and peripheral compatibility became more consistent, reducing the number of situations where users had to search forums for obscure fixes. The average person installing Linux in 2026 is far less likely to encounter the dreaded black screen or missing Wi-Fi driver that once scared newcomers away. Yet perhaps the biggest transformation isn't technical at all, it's cultural. The Linux community has slowly shifted from an elitist reputation toward a more welcoming, beginner-friendly environment. Tutorials, graphical tools, and documentation have improved massively. Influencers and educators produce content that explains Linux without assuming deep technical knowledge. Instead of telling new users to read the manual, many communities now focus on guiding them through the transition. This change in tone has made Linux feel less like a secret club and more like an open invitation. Software availability, another long-standing concern, has evolved in unexpected ways. Traditional arguments about missing applications don't carry the same weight in an era dominated by web apps and cross-platform development frameworks. Many tools now run directly in the browser or offer Linux versions by default. Containerization and sandbox package systems allow developers to distribute software without worrying about dependency conflicts. Creative professionals who once felt locked into proprietary ecosystems are discovering alternatives that continue to mature year after year. While certain niche programs still lack native Linux versions, the gap has narrowed enough that many users can switch without sacrificing their workflow. Security and privacy have always been strengths of Linux, but in 2026 they play a different role in the conversation. As people grow more concerned about data collection, Subscription models and forced updates, Linux represents a sense of control that feels increasingly rare. Users can customize their system, choose when to update, and avoid unwanted telemetry. This autonomy resonates with individuals who feel overwhelmed by corporate operating systems that push ads, integrate cloud services by default, or restrict customization. The perception of Linux has shifted from alternative to escape, offering a platform that prioritizes user choice over corporate strategy. Of course, not everything is perfect. Linux still faces challenges that prevent it from completely dominating the desktop market. Some specialized software remains tied to proprietary platforms. Certain hardware features may require manual tweaks. Enterprise environments sometimes rely on tools designed specifically for Windows infrastructure. And despite massive improvements, the sheer variety of distributions can still confuse newcomers who just want a straightforward experience. But the difference in 2026 is that these issues no longer define Linux as fundamentally flawed. Instead, they feel like manageable trade-offs within an ecosystem that continues to evolve. One fascinating aspect of Linux's progress is how it happened without a single controlling company dictating the direction. Unlike operating systems driven by corporate roadmaps, Linux evolves through collaboration between communities, independent developers, and organizations that contribute improvements back to the ecosystem. This decentralized growth has allowed innovation to happen faster and in unexpected ways. Features that once took years to develop now appear rapidly, driven by shared effort rather than competitive secrecy. The result is an operating system that feels alive, constantly adapting to new technologies and user expectations. The rise of AI-assisted tools has also played a surprising role in making Linux more accessible. Tasks that once required deep technical knowledge can now be explained or automated through intelligent interfaces. New users who might have felt intimidated by the terminal can receive step-by-step guidance in real time. Documentation becomes interactive rather than static, reducing the learning curve that once discouraged people from trying Linux. Instead of eliminating the need to learn, these tools empower users to experiment without fear of breaking their system. Another factor shaping Linux's reputation is the changing landscape of computing itself. The traditional desktop is no longer the only focus of innovation. Cloud services, edge devices, and hybrid workflows blur the line between local and remote computing. Linux thrives in these environments because of its flexibility and efficiency. Developers who build applications for servers or containers often prefer to use Linux on their personal machines for consistency. As more people enter tech-related fields, the familiarity of Linux becomes an advantage rather than an obstacle. The story of Linux in 2026 is also a story about perception. For years, mainstream media portrayed it as a niche tool for enthusiasts. Yet millions of devices ran Linux behind the scenes. From smartphones to smart TVs to embedded systems, Linux quietly powered much of the modern world. Now that desktop Linux is catching up in usability, the invisible giant is finally stepping into the spotlight. People who once dismissed it as too technical are discovering that it can feel just as polished as the systems they're used to, sometimes even more so. Community-driven innovation continues to push boundaries in design and functionality. Desktop environments have become visually refined, offering smooth animations, modern layouts, and deep customization options. Users can transform their interface into almost anything they imagine, from minimal productivity-focused setups to visually stunning artistic creations. This freedom appeals to creators who want their computer to reflect their personality rather than conform to a predefined aesthetic. Education and accessibility have also improved significantly. Schools and organizations increasingly adopt Linux to reduce costs and promote digital literacy. Students exposed to Linux early in their learning journey often grow comfortable with its concepts, which helps normalize it as a legitimate alternative rather than an experimental choice. As more people gain familiarity, the myth that Linux is only for experts continues to fade. Yet the question remains, has Linux truly lost its biggest weakness? The answer depends on how you define that weakness. If it was complexity, then modern tools and user-focused distributions have dramatically reduced it. If it was software compatibility, cross-platform development and compatibility layers have narrowed the gap. If it was gaming, the progress over the past few years has changed the narrative completely. But perhaps the real weakness was perception itself. Linux didn't just need technical improvements. It needed a shift in how people thought about it. In 2026, Linux feels less like an underdog and more like a quiet contender reshaping the desktop landscape. It hasn't abandoned its roots in open-source philosophy, yet it has embraced usability in ways that make it accessible to a wider audience. The ecosystem is more cohesive, the tools are more polished, and the community is more welcoming than ever before. While it may never replace every other operating system, it no longer needs to. Its growth is steady, organic, and driven by users who genuinely believe in its potential. The truth about Linux today isn't that it suddenly became perfect, but that it matured. Decades of development, experimentation, and collaboration have turned it into an operating system that balances power with approachability. New users can explore it without feeling lost, while experienced enthusiasts still enjoy the depth and flexibility that made them fall in love with Linux in the first place. And as technology continues to evolve, Linux stands ready to adapt, not because a single company demands it, but because a global community believes in building something better together. So has Linux finally lost its biggest weakness? Maybe the more honest answer is that it learned to transform that weakness into a strength. The diversity that once felt confusing now offers choice. The complexity that once scared people away now empowers them to customize their experience. The lack of mainstream attention that once limited adoption allowed the community to grow without pressure, refining the system until it was ready for a broader audience. In 2026, Linux doesn't feel like it's trying to catch up anymore. Instead, it feels like it's finally arriving at a moment where everything it has been building towards starts to make sense, and the rest of the world is just beginning to notice.